we want to talk about the different efforts in various states across the country with regards to enhancing election integrity. It's a very important topic of conversation because, look, as I said before, I don't believe the election was stolen. I believe Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. But that does not mean, nor is it separate from the idea that there are issues of concern that have happened across this country with regards to the 2020 elections, different processes that were put in place, how vote by mail was done in various states, some voter fraud concerns, so on and so forth. Those two things can be the case, and we need to improve and secure our elections across the country. Colorado, where I live, is a great place when it comes to election integrity overall. There are definitely things to be worked on, but it is a state that for years has already been implementing a vote-by-mail system, going back to 2013. But it's important to keep in mind that it took years to develop, to get to the point, as we've talked about on this show before, to get to the point where Colorado could actually make that switch to vote-by-mail, to mail ballot voting, at 100% mail ballot voting system, unless somebody chooses they want to go vote in person. It's not something that can happen overnight like a lot of these states did. You need to make sure that your systems are tightened up. So how can we do that? And what about what states like Georgia and Florida, Arizona and Alabama and others have been doing? Are those the right ways to approach election integrity, or should we be going with the House Democrats want to do, which is HR1 and Senate Resolution 1, an expansive federal government control takeover of our elections? Let's talk about it with today's Crossroads panel, an esteemed group that I am very pleased to welcome to Jimmy at the Crossroads in partnership with the Washington Examiner. In the top right corner, we've got Ken Blackwell, the Honorable Ken Blackwell, who, among other many hats that he has worn, he is the former Secretary of State for Ohio. We also have Matt Crane in the bottom left corner. He is the Executive Director of the Colorado County Clerks Association, and for years was my county clerk. In fact, he was the county clerk for Arapahoe County, Colorado, when we implemented vote by mail in the state. And now he is, as I said, Executive Director of the Colorado County Clerks Association. And in the bottom right corner, we have Garrett Bess, who's the Vice President at Heritage Action for America. And both these gentlemen join me now. Without further ado, welcome to the show. It is so good to have all three of you on. I really appreciate the time today.
Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense.
You're getting at something very important, I think, Garrett Bess, and that is the idea of federalism, that elections are done best when states are able to craft their own policies, their own procedures, yes, with best practices, but not with top-down federal government control, which brings us, for example, to HR1, this bill in Congress that the Democrats are trying to get through that would be very much a federal takeover. I want to show pick number one, panel one, which is a little excerpt. I'm a columnist at the Denver Gazette, a sister publication here in Colorado to the Washington Examiner, and I'm very concerned about this relative to Colorado. I say, for example, Colorado has made improvements over the years. We still have more to do yet. If HR1 becomes law, we won't be able to make the enhancements. Instead, Congress will tie Colorado's hands, limit our ability to strengthen election integrity, and force a rigid one-size-fits-all approach upon us. In short, HR1 will eradicate Colorado's ability to stay atop other states as the gold standard. Matt Crane, as a former Colorado County clerk and someone who helped oversee the transition to vote by mail in Colorado, where we do have a lot of best practices in place. You know the rough road that it's taken for Colorado to really get things enhanced. I worry about a top-down federal regime that says all states must follow these rules.
Jimmy, that's absolutely right. It's funny, you know, when you hear people talk, proponents of HR1 talk about it, they say, oh, well, we want to follow great examples like Colorado. But what's in that proposed legislation would hurt the way that Colorado conducts its elections. We've been able to take, as you said, lessons learned and adapt over time to a point where, we know we still have some work to do, but our model's in pretty good shape. I'm a firm believer that, the states should be able to determine what voting laws work best for them. What's great for Colorado may not be great for Florida or Georgia or California, or even though California's modeled pretty closely after us. We should trust people in their own states to come up with laws that work for them. Now with that said, I think there's some responsibility that some states should have, not to go too far to where you're unnecessarily restricting access. And so that's something that we should keep an eye on. But by and large, states should be able to determine how they conduct their own elections. And HR1, there's a lot of problematic aspects to HR1 that I just wish they'd take a time out and let the states have these conversations.
Ken Blackwell, you were a Secretary of State for Ohio. How would you have liked it if the federal government said, we're going to now dictate how Ohio conducts its elections? And what would your concerns have been?
One, I would have been ticked off because I'm a constitutionalist and I understand what was the guiding principle of our founders and the framers of our Constitution. It was to make sure that we put a harness on the reach and power and intrusiveness of the federal or central government. And therefore, there was a principle that was used, the principle of subsidiarity, that government that is closest to the people is the government that governs best. And therefore, responsibility for elections, processes, and practices were invested in state legislatures and administered at the local level, at the precinct level, where you had neighbors working with neighbors. And therefore, what you had was a tight ballot chain of custody, and you had a built-in verification system. And so this is a government overreach. This is at the heart of the problem. It would federalize, centralize the election process. And those of us who understand that why we have been the most prosperous, the most diverse constitutional republic in all of human history is because we put a harness on the reach of the federal government. Yeah. This would in fact give one party control at the federal level, and that would be a destruction of our federal system.
No two ways about it. Garrett Bess, I know Heritage Action for America has really been one of those organizations leading the charge against HR1. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, HR1, I think our principle and what we've been advocating for at the state level is make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. But HR1 or the S1 Senate component or companion bill would make it easier to cheat and harder to detect, as Senator Roy Blunt put it last week. And so this bill really strips states and of the ability to administer their elections in the way that those states feel works best. I know Matt is from Colorado, and some of those Western states have all mail-in balloting, and that's fine because in the West you have people separated, and there's not necessarily huge population centers, but there's tiny.
It looks like Garrett just cut out for a moment here. Matt Crane, let me ask you about Colorado. When it comes to our state having implemented vote by mail many years ago, I mean, what are a couple of the things that have actually made it work successfully?
Well, the fact, Jimmy, that's a great question. I think the fact that we had a 15-year runway where we went in 1998 to no excuse absentee voting. In about 2005, we went to a permanent mail-in absentee list. In 8 or 9, we started being able to allow to run our primary and coordinated, so our off-year elections by mail. So we had worked over a series of years to be able to grow our processes and mature our processes. So when 1303 passed in 2013, we were already familiar. We had good concepts of chain of custody. We had good concepts of with our voting systems and what it looked like, even though we kept evolving on that. We had already started working towards implementing risk limiting audits. So we had already taken a lot of steps. And I think, you know, for the states that, I mean, if you think about it, it took us 15 years. And in the 2020 election cycle, you know, some states made that move in 180 days.
Right.
And so that's a really, obviously, a very condensed timeline to be able to do that. And so, you know, we had calls with states all across the country that were looking to do that and trying to help the best we can. But there's no way that a state can do something in 180 days and do it as well as Colorado does it when we've had 15 years to make that move.
Looks like we got you back, Garrett. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry about that. Having internet connectivity issues over here.
No problem. It happens.
I was simply saying that, you know, the goal of constitutional conservatives really should be to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. HR1 S1, to quote Senator Roy Blunt, makes it easier to cheat and harder to detect. There's various things that these bills are intended to do, but all of them revolve around stripping states of their rights and their abilities to institute voting systems that work for them in their state. For example, it mandates same-day registration. There are states that have same-day registration, but you know, not every state necessarily needs same-day registration. It also mandates that that votes be counted whether they're in a particular precinct that they're assigned to or not. It mandates no voter ID laws. So in states that have done, for example, voter ID accompanied with mail-in balloting to make sure that that is a lawfully cast ballot, it would strip away that voter ID requirement and therefore jeopardize that mail-in ballot now.
And that dovetails in then with what's happening at states across the country. Again, we're talking with Garrett Bess, Vice President of Government Relations and Communications at Heritage Action for America, Matt Crane, Executive Director of the Colorado County Clerks Association, and former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell, who's also co-chair of the board of the International Federation for Election Systems. I want to put up panel 3. This is some of the example of some of the statements that have been leveled against various efforts in states in the country, from Florida to Arkansas to Arizona and Texas and elsewhere, Georgia. And you can see there that Georgia, according to 538, Georgia is hardly the only state that's made it harder to vote. Republican lawmakers have now enacted new voting restrictions in a total of 11 states. The Brennan Center, that's a left-wing think tank, and a backlash to 2020's historic voter turnout, and under the pretense of responding to baseless and racist allegations of voter fraud and election irregularities, state lawmakers have introduced a startling number of bills to curb the vote. You could see some of those phrases there: backlash to a historic voter turnout, racist allegations, curb the vote, new voting restrictions, make it harder to vote. Ken Blackwell, what do you make of those claims, and do you think those are accurate descriptors of what's happening in states around the country?
Well, they're not accurate, and they're acts of desperation by the left. Look, just take HR1, S1, and they're doing away with, just destroying state requirements for voter ID, meaning that anybody could claim to be anybody they want to be and actually vote. Well, what is racist about, you know, a voter ID? We use IDs for everything. If I was going to leave, you know, tickets for you guys at the Cincinnati Reds game at the will call window, what do you have to show? You have to show an ID. If you want to get on an airplane, you have to show an ID. If you want to take out a library book, you have to show an ID. To now say that it is racist for, in fact, that to be a verification requirement for casting a ballot, because it would in fact enhance voter confidence in the result, it's just stupid on its face.
And Matt Crane, I do want to ask you about voter ID and your take. I mean, you represent Republican and Democrat county clerks in the 64 counties that make Colorado, and I think there are a couple of unaffiliated clerks as well. What is the nature of the game for a state like Colorado when it comes to voter ID and verification, as well as verification of signatures, and how do you think that fits in with some of the legislation being proposed around the country in other states?
So Colorado right now is not a strict photo ID state. So you do have to show some kind of ID, but it can be a utility bill. I'm speaking with my personal hat on and not my association hat on. When I was clerk and recorder, I always supported photo ID. I think poll after poll shows majority of Americans believe in photo ID, including majority of people of color. So, to me, this isn't something that really should be as debated as hotly as it is. I mean, in 2014, President Obama said that photo ID wasn't stopping people from voting. It was other things like apathy and lack of education and these types of things. And I agree with that completely. And those are things that we can work with through the process, through voter education campaigns. I think there's a lot that we can do about that. But the level of conversation right now, as Senator Blackwell said, is that it's racist or disproportionately impacts people of color. And so that's where the battle lines have been drawn around ID. In Colorado, we have pretty good signature verification processes here, but that doesn't mean we can't get better. One of the things we're going to start pushing for shortly is, consistent and more robust ways that we can audit the work around signature verification to make sure that a judge in Arapahoe County is trained the same at adjudicating signatures the same as somebody in Boulder County or Denver County or Mesa County out on the Western Slope, because it's important that these things are being handled consistently so that we're not creating equal protection issues, so that a voter in Denver may have their signature examined more harshly or less harshly a voter in Arapahoe County. So there are good steps in place here in Colorado, but we're constantly working to improve them and to make them better.
Garrett Bess, Heritage Action for America, I know, has been very active in promoting and being involved in these various bills. What do you make of some of the criticisms of, say, Georgia or Florida or Texas, and overall what they're doing? And is there anything that stands out as being particularly important in terms of their efforts?
Well, I mean, I think that, people are getting tired of being called racist just simply for believing in basic common sense things such as voter ID laws. I mean, Ken said it great. And I think even Matt referenced some of the polling, like, even in Georgia, something like more than 60% of African-American Georgians actually support voter ID laws. And so this is not something that is targeted at any particular race. It's simply defending all Americans' right and privilege to vote for the elected officials that they choose. I think corporate America, in some sectors, certainly not all of it, but in some areas, really sort of jumped the gun on their criticism of these laws. They face significant backlash, and in many cases, even some of the high-level names that you saw initially come out, laws, particularly in places like Georgia and Texas, have quietly tried to walk those positions back and get back the pushback from conservative grassroots and Americans that support these things has had an effect on the corporations as well.
I want to go to the allegation about racist laws, for example, when it comes to Georgia. And I wrote a column for the Denver Gazette also on how Colorado ends up with Major League Baseball All-Star game, and I think that's a loss for America. The win for Colorado is a loss for America, in my view, and it doesn't represent or reflect what's actually the case in Georgia. But here, of course, in April, is what President Biden said about Georgia making comparisons to Jim Crow laws.
And so I'm convinced that we'll be able to stop this, because it is the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. I mean, this is gigantic, what they're trying to do. And it cannot be sustained. And do everything in my power, along with my friends in the House and the Senate, to keep that from becoming the law.
I think, first of all, former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell, that's way off base. I mean, I'm not aware of poll taxes or poll tests that are in this Georgia law that was recently passed, first of all. Second of all, I think what Republicans and what people who are just in general advocating for some more election integrity are trying to do is strike a balance here between making sure that more people are able to cast votes and also that there isn't, as Garrett said, cheating that's going on, that we can ensure that people who are casting votes are valid voters. What's your take on all that?
Garrett was right. We are all in this to make it easier to vote, harder to cheat. Look, you guys are probably a tad bit younger than I am. And back in the 60s, when I couldn't even vote because the age limit was 21, but I could drive. I was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was in Clarksdale, Mississippi. And let me tell you, when a black person would go into a voting booth and would ask, how many jelly beans are in this jar? And if they didn't get the exact number, which they never did, they couldn't vote. To equate, reforms in Georgia and Florida and elsewhere with that sort of practice, again, it's stupid on its face. We in fact have been working to make sure that again we had tight control over the chain of custody of ballots and common sense verification processes. Joe Biden was saying that anything that required a voter ID, whether it's photo or any kind of voter ID, or block the unlimited use of ballot harvesting was racist, shows me that he thinks people are dumb. And that is an insult in and of itself. And that's why he's getting the pushback. And I would imagine that he will have to start walking some of this stuff back, just like Delta, just like Coca-Cola and others.
We're going to wrap up in a moment with our guests, Matt Crane, Ken Blackwell, and Garrett Bess here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Really appreciate your time today. I want to throw up just sort of my summation for recent Denver Gazette column of what was going on in Georgia. And I think this is very important to put in perspective. To be clear, in Georgia, no excuse mail ballots are still legal. The time window for early voting is longer. Voter ID requirements are now the same for mail ballots as in person. They're claiming that there's some different standards, some tightening of the rules specifically for mail ballots. No, they're simply saying voter ID requirements are going to be the same as for in-person voting. And drop boxes are required, giving voters more places to drop off ballots. Where is this Jim Crow 2.0 exactly? And I think it's important to keep that in perspective. But as we wrap up, I want to ask about striking the balance. Matt Crane first, coming from Colorado as the executive director of the Colorado County Clerks Association. What would you advise in different states as they strike this balance and really need to work together across party lines, as has happened in shaping previous legislation in Colorado to a good extent, in order to make sure that there is that kind of election integrity? And also, what about ballot drop boxes in your view? Because there's a lot of discussion of that, and actually a couple of these bills do seem to address that in ways that may limit where you're able to put them.
So a couple of things. I'll take your second question first and then come back to the more broader question. In Colorado, we've built our model around ballot drop boxes. We feel like it's a pretty secure process for people to be able to return their ballots. We all know our friends at the post office, while they do a great job, their record isn't 100%. So we feel like ballot drop boxes are a more secure and accessible way to make sure that the county gets your ballot. And then when you think about ballot tracks and other tools that we've implemented in Colorado, our friends in Denver started that, but now everybody across the state does it. It allows a lot of transparency around that process so a person can follow their ballot throughout its life cycle. To your first question, Jimmy, I think about the broader conversation of what that looks like. I think we have to start with a place to where we get back to telling the truth. There's been so much mis and disinfo about what happened in 2020. And, when you say that, most people think it comes from the right. And to be sure, there is plenty of mis and disinfo that's come from the right. But when you look at the responses, as we've heard from Ken and Garrett, about what's happening in Georgia and in other states, there's been disinfo about that and misinfo coming from the left too, trying to scare people, trying to scare their base into coming out, and supporting, whatever, policy points they want to, push forward. So we have to get back to a place, and, I know politics, I'm not naive to politics, but we have to get back to a place to where we're speaking more honestly about what's happening, what are the intended impacts of legislation, what does the data say, what does the polling say, like around photo ID, and it's really incumbent, I think, on voters as well, on citizens, If you want to know about what happens in your election process, don't listen to Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity. Call your local election official. Get to know your local election official. Go watch an election. Go serve as an election judge. Participate in the process so that you can learn firsthand. And so you can say, oh, you know what? What I just heard there isn't true. I can tell you this is true. I always told people when I was elected, you can be our best ambassadors to talk about what's real and what's not in this process. And a lot of times when we got people in and we gave them tours of our facility and talked to them, they came away and said, wow, so what I heard here on this station, this radio station, or on that television show isn't true. And it's like, no, it's not true. So really, it's, you know, people have a big ownership stake in this too. Go and visit your election office and learn firsthand what happens.
Garrett Bess, your thoughts on striking the balance. Do you think that states that are advancing election integrity bills are doing that, striking that balance?
Well, I certainly think that this round of election bills that are proceeding through the states or have already proceeded are balanced. You know, the idea that in 2018 ballot drop boxes basically didn't exist in Georgia, then all of a sudden you have a pandemic in which they were all over the place, and then Georgia decides to codify how a ballot box should appear in the context of elections. That is a very balanced and representative way to go about verifying how ballots are submitted.
Garrett, can I just underscore your point that here in Colorado, we have specific, which is hailed as the gold standard across the board. We actually have specific standards in this state on ballot drop boxes, just as Georgia's doing now.
Yeah. I mean, and again, don't quote me exactly on what Georgia's law specifically does with ballot boxes, but if I remember correctly, they simply say they have to be on a county property. Yeah. And so essentially...
And some security precautions need to be taken too.
Yeah, and so, you know, and look, there's a whole conversation we could have about ballot drop boxes and what the left wants to try to do with them. I mean, the left is not, you know, saints in this process. They make sure ballot drop boxes occur in precincts in which they think they will get an overwhelming number of votes. And, you know, it's not that ballot drop boxes in and of themselves are wrong or right. If a state wants to use them, just make sure it's a secure method that you use them. And so I think that Georgia and other states that are contemplating legislation along those lines have been balanced. But then, like what Matt said, the ability to track your ballot through the process and verify when it's counted, I mean, that's a really, really good principle to follow, and that is just transparent. Americans will trust a vote if they lose the vote, if it's a transparent process. What they don't trust is when they can't figure out what happened. They don't have transparency into how the ballots are counted. They don't understand where their ballot went to, and who's responsible for counting it. And whenever you have that, that's a scenario for mistrust in the elections process. And so, transparency methods, those are the things that Americans really all should support. And then we can have a battle of ideas, knowing for sure that the elected results will be true.
And final word to former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell. Sir, what are your thoughts on striking that balance and where the states are headed?
We have to keep it simple, keep it local, keep it bipartisan. We must be the resistance to this unprecedented power grab to centralize, to federalize the management and the administration of elections. We, in fact, understand very clearly what was at stake when the framers of our Constitution put the harness on the federal government, the central government, to make sure that power stayed with the people. And that is reflected in our election systems and the way they are structured. We can always do better. And that's what we're seeing state after state, are reforms that will build voter confidence in the results that are provided by elections.
Gentlemen, we went long and we had oh, there we go. There's the applause for you. We do appreciate your time, former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell, also, as I mentioned, board co-chair of the International Federation for Electoral Systems. Matt Crane, executive director of the Colorado County Clerks Association, former clerk for Arapahoe County, and Garrett Bess, Vice President of Government Relations and Communications at Heritage Action for America. I really appreciate your time today joining us to discuss this very important issue. Make no mistake about it. We need to have trust in the process and also make it feasible for people to participate in that process, and striking that balance, I think, is key. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks, Jimmy. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you. Once
Thank
again.
you.
Ken Blackwell, Matt Crane, and Garrett Bess all joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads today. And let's just be clear about something. Striking that balance and having that bipartisan approach is crucial. We do need the states across this country to make sure that they are approaching this in a way that has the people of their states in mind, and that doesn't simply get caught up in political jargon or ideas like, okay, we've got voter suppression, or we've got this, or we've got that. We need to have a serious conversation about this, which is why I thought having different voices on the program made sense. And, Ken Blackwell talking about federalism. That's fundamental to our system of government and the Constitution altogether here in the United States of America. And it, without question, should be applied to our election systems. Going to the points made by Matt Crane about it taking 15 years to get to the point here in Colorado, where he and I both are, where we could switch to vote by mail. Then you had years of changes and tweaks to the system. You can't make those kind of tweaks to the system if the all-knowing, all-powerful federal government comes in with something like HR1 or S1 and says, this is how you're going to do it. That's what I mean by striking the balance. A, making sure that the states are able to do what they want to do in their systems to ensure election integrity and access to the vote. But we also need to make sure that when we are approaching these discussions in various states, that you are, as Matt Crane said, talking about the facts, talking about the details, getting into the specifics. And Garrett Bess was also emphasizing the point that certain policies and certain efforts will be better in one state or another state. You need to have that kind of flexibility, and you need to be focused on what's the best way to actually make sure that we can have confidence in the vote and that people can get to the polls. And I do agree that both sides are missing the mark to some extent on that, oftentimes in the discussion. But I think these bills are mostly on point in that regard. Certainly the bill in Georgia is one that I feel very confident in saying seems quite good on the whole. And certainly not meriting removing, I think $190 million in economic benefits to Atlanta to come here to Denver in the name of racial justice or something. There are a lot more people in the black community in Atlanta than here in Colorado. What's that about? Is that really advancing some sort of racial justice cause? I don't think so. Let's be honest, let's be open, and let's have integrity in this discussion and approach it in a way that does justice to our republic and to its citizens.